Welcome back to our discussion about torts. So let's talk a little bit about how we may think about the amount to award someone in damages. If a plaintiff is successful at showing the elements of a case, then they are entitled to be made whole by the defendant. So the court system typically uses an award of damages to try to make that happen. How do we figure out how much money that will be to make a person whole? So it's helpful here to think about indifference curves. We talked about how an indifference curve is a way that an economist thinks about on two axes. We'll usually talk about money and health. An indifference curve is a combination of money and health at which people are equally happy. So if you're healthier, you could have a little bit less money. If you're going to be less healthy, you're going to need more money to be indifferent between those things, to be on the same curve, right? So to make someone whole, we move them back to the same indifference curve they were on before. We usually can't simply give them better health, so we usually give them money to try to put them back on that indifference curve. But to figure out how much money it'll take to make someone indifferent between where they were before and where they are now, it's tricky. We ask them how much, and they may give a straight answer, or understandably, they may say $100 million, even if $1 million would actually bring them back to the same indifference curve. So it's hard to, it's hard for people to think about how much money it would actually take to make them the same as they were before all of this stuff happened, whatever this stuff was. And two, they have a strong incentive to make that a big number, right? So we need to look for evidence to help support what a plaintiff may say would take to bring them back to the level they were at. And that's where we often look at things like, how much are people willing to spend on their own safety? If I'm willing to spend an extra $800 on a car that has an additional safety feature, so it's, say, a package on a car that costs more, it's a safety package, and the car is identical otherwise, but it is safer. Well, I could use that as evidence that I'm willing to spend at least $800 for that additional amount of safety, whatever that additional amount of safety is. Maybe having special side curtain airbags or something along those lines. Now, the most common place to look for evidence about this money-risk trade-off is in the labor market. So if we look at people who are working in similar jobs, but one is riskier than the other, economic theory says that you're going to have to pay people a little bit more money to take on that risky job. You're going to have to compensate them to take that additional risk on. And the amount that you'll have to compensate them, that's pretty good evidence of this risk-money trade-off people are willing to face. So that amount of money is what economists measure to kind of back out what we call the value of statistical life. We can actually think about this with our hand formula. We talked about the burden of protection of extra precaution should be equal to the probability of loss times the amount of the loss. Well, here, if we're trying to figure out what the amount of loss is, we can actually back that out by taking the burden of extra precaution and dividing it by the probability of loss. That's actually what I've just been talking about when I was talking about something like backing out the wage premium for a risky job, or paying additional money for an extra safety feature in a car. Those are both examples of where we are taking the burden of extra precaution, dividing it by the probability of a bad thing happening. How much is that extra protection you're getting? And those are giving us a value of statistical life. It's not saying a life is worth that much. It says this is evidence of how much people are willing to pay for their own safety, to decrease by a small probability the chance that something bad will happen to them. And so value of statistical life is something that is really important. It's sometimes used in court cases to help determine how much people should be compensated as damages. A lot of states actually don't allow VSL evidence when it comes to damages. And partially this is a bias against newer, more cutting edge sort of techniques and thinking. The legal system is in some ways quite conservative, traditional, so it definitely has a premium placed on techniques that have been used for a long time that people are familiar with. Um, so a lot of states to calculate damages will look at how much people would have earned. They'll look at some amount of the loss felt by immediate family members and such if someone is killed, certainly, or even if they're harmed in a major way so they're not able to participate in things they normally would. Try to come up with a value by adding up some of those things together. Theoretically, if we include all the things that should be thought of in ways that someone is harmed by not being able to do what they used to be able to do, uh, it will end up equaling the value of statistical life, what we get by looking at what people are willing to pay to prevent bad things from happening by changing that probability a little bit. VSL is really important when it comes to government policy and thinking about, should we enact a new regulation that's more strict on a certain type of air pollutant? So cost-benefit analysis of a lot of different government policies, whether that's talking about highway safety, worker safety, environmental safety. We need to take the very known risks, costs of making things safer and weigh it against the benefits. Well, that means we're going to need to have benefits measured in dollars to be able to compare it to these costs that are in dollars, or we'll have to have the cost measured in, say, lives and health and safety, because that's what the benefits are, right? We need to get some common unit to be able to compare these things. VSL is a way for us to think about the benefits of making people healthier and safer converted into dollars to be able to compare it to cost, to think about how a regulation may make people better off in aggregate or not. Now, we hear about that a lot right now, or you may not. Certainly on my news feed and the people that I follow, this is a big discussion right now with coronavirus. So a lot of people are talking about this trade-off between money and safety, right? Saying, well, is it worth it for us to shut down the economy essentially in order to save some lives? We know we would be losing some lives anyway because of flu, because of car accidents, because of lots of stuff. Should we be willing to shut down our economy to save some lives because of coronavirus? And one way to start thinking about this is to think about the value of statistical life, the VSL, and it's not exactly what we're looking for here, in the sense that the VSL is measured by looking at small changes in the probability of, say, death. Now, for certain age groups, that's probably a pretty good fit for coronavirus. So if we're talking about younger age groups, such as you guys, your probability of going to the hospital if you catch coronavirus might be 1 in 20 or something along those lines. Of those in your age group who go to the hospital, maybe 1 in 4 will have a serious case and perhaps have to go to ICU. And of people who have to go to ICU, maybe 1 in 4 ends up dying from it. So that ends up being roughly a 1 in 200 chance of dying from the coronavirus if you catch it, conditional on catching it. So that's a fairly low probability if the probability of getting infected is quite low. Then we would be talking about a small number out of, say, 100,000, which is how we usually measure a lot of these risks we're talking about, say, worker risks on the job. So if we're talking about an elderly population, the coronavirus risk is actually much, much higher, right? And so conditional on catching coronavirus, if you're 80 plus, the probability of dying from it might be on the order of 1 in 5 or something along those lines. That's not a small probability. That's a very large probability when we're talking about an outcome like death. So the VSL actually isn't measured in a way to capture that big a change in probability. The VSL is measuring a small change in probability. So you could think of the VSL as almost a lower bound. And why is that? Well, that's because people are willing to pay more money for more safety to avoid risks of things like death, or conversely, they have to be paid money to take on risks, like working in a riskier job. But people are understandably feel very strongly about something like death. If we're talking about bigger probabilities, people are willing to pay a lot more money to avoid it. And that's one reason we see a lot of people saying, listen, we need to shut this down. Our public health experts say to contain the spread of coronavirus, we really need to be doing aggressive social distancing right now, having as many people at home as possible. And one way to support that is to say, well, each life we're saving, based on what people are generally willing to spend for their own safety, we could think of as being about $10 million in benefit for each life that we save by enacting these aggressive policies. But that's almost certainly a lower bound, because for many people we're talking about much bigger probabilities that they would actually be willing to pay much more to avoid than this. So if we're talking about saving thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of lives times $10 million each, we're talking about really big numbers. The benefits of enacting these aggressive policies to prevent the spread of coronavirus. So that's how cost-benefit analysis could play out in a situation like this. Yes, trying to freeze the economy, shut things down, it's not a simple task. It has very real costs and consequences to it. It also potentially has really big benefits if we are avoiding a lot of deaths by doing it. So that's one way to kind of connect how we think about damages for an individual in a tort case to how do we make good policy for coronavirus today. This concept of value of statistical life is something that can be helpful thinking about both of those situations, even if it's not exactly on point for either of them in some ways. We'll talk more soon. Thanks.